Hello everybody, in today's video we're going to be going over Major Tropical Storm Ida, which over the next couple of hours and couple of days is expected to become at least a Category 3 hurricane over the central Gulf of Mexico. As it continues to head further to the northwest, it's expected to make landfall somewhere in Louisiana or Mississippi as, again, a strong Category 2 storm. And then eventually, as it moves inland, flash flooding will become a big threat, especially for areas like Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, and areas further northeast of there. So we're going to be covering this storm and giving you all the information you need to know in today's video. So make sure you are staying tuned all the way until the end. Here's a look at the current National Hurricane Center page. You can see that we have three storms. We have Invest 97L, which is up in the north central Atlantic. That has a 50% chance of developing within the next 2 days, and within the next 5 days, it has a 60% chance of developing. That's out to sea, so no real land impacts from that. Invest 98L has a 70% chance of developing within the next 48 hours, and within the next 5 days, it has about an 80% chance of developing. But if you look at the cone forecast for that one as well, you can see this is also going out to sea. We're not dealing with any land impacts from both of these storms. Tropical Storm Ida, which is soon to become, or is expected to become, a hurricane, is currently sitting just south of Cuba, and this is the main storm that we're going to be covering in today's video. Before we do that, let's get into the current information on all of these storms. Invest 97L, that's the one in the north central Atlantic. That's located at 33.4 degrees north by 52.7 degrees west, maximum winds of about 29 miles per hour, minimum pressure of 1,014 millibars. And then if you look at the satellite imagery of this, you can see it's not too organized as of right now. We do have some thunderstorm activity and some convection going on with this storm, but it's not too impressive, especially compared to other storms which are out in the Atlantic, including Invest 98L and Tropical Storm Ida. If we look at Invest 98L, it's located at 12.4 degrees north by 45.8 degrees west. You can see on the bottom left-hand part of your screen, here's the coast of northwest or northeastern South America, so that kind of gives you an idea of exactly where that's located. Maximum winds of 29 miles per hour, minimum pressure of 1,008 millibars with this system. You can see this is a little bit more organized, although both of them are quite disorganized in general. So they could, of course, become tropical storms. It's not going to really matter. It's just going to tick off one more name off the list, but it's not going to really have any impacts. Either of these will not have any impacts really on land. It's mainly just going to be out to sea, and again, no land impacts are expected from these storms. Taking a look at Tropical Storm Ida, which definitely will have some land impacts, you can see how developed it is on the satellite imagery. The actual low pressure is right in here. So here's the center of that storm. You can see a bunch of convection on the northern and eastern side of the cyclone, and most of that convection is currently over the mainland of Cuba, especially for central and western Cuba especially. And then eventually, as that crosses over the much flatter portion of Cuba, which doesn't have as much mountainous terrain as the eastern side of Cuba, as that moves further northwest, it's going into a very favorable environment over the Gulf of Mexico. Warm waters, little to no wind shear, and really nothing else impeding it. So this is going to have the chance at becoming a major hurricane, and I would not rule it out. I think a Category 3 storm is definitely likely at this point. Located at 20.7 degrees north by 82.1 degrees west, maximum winds of 65 miles per hour, so already nearing hurricane Category 1 force. That's just about 9 miles per hour lower than Cat 1 force. Minimum pressure, 996 millibars, moving northwest at about 15 miles per hour. So it's moving at a fairly steady clip. So it's not going to be on land or not going to be impacting land for quite a while until it hits Louisiana. So it's moving quickly off land, off these islands in the Caribbean. And once it does so, it's going to have a ton of time to organize itself and develop all within that area, which it's not going to be impeded by anything really. Not really any dry air within there, not really any wind shear, no Saharan dust to deal with, and there's really warm sea surface temperatures also there. So you have pretty much a perfect environment for this storm to strengthen, unfortunately. Taking a look at the key messages, the first one says life-threatening storm surge and hurricane conditions are expected later today and tonight in portions of western Cuba, including the Isle of Youth, where a hurricane warning is in effect. Life-threatening heavy rains, flash flooding, and mudslides are expected across Jamaica, the Cayman Islands, and western Cuba, including the Isle of Youth. Second one says the risk of life-threatening storm surge inundation is increasing along the coast of Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. Inundation of 7 to 11 feet above ground level is possible within the area from Morgan City, Louisiana to Ocean Springs, Mississippi, including Lake Borgne. Interest in these areas should follow any advice given by local officials. Third one says Ida is expected to be a dangerous major hurricane when it reaches the northern Gulf of Mexico coast on Sunday. And the risk of hurricane force winds continues to increase, especially along portions of the Louisiana coast, including metropolitan New Orleans. Potentially devastating wind damage could occur where the core of Ida moves onshore. And finally, Ida is likely to produce heavy rainfall later Sunday into Monday across the central Gulf Coast from southeast Louisiana to coastal Mississippi and Alabama, as well as the lower Mississippi River Valley, resulting in considerable flash, urban, small stream, and river flooding. Looking at the current watches and warnings for this storm, you can see that we have some hurricane warnings in effect for western Cuba. We also have some tropical storm warnings, which are in effect just to the east of there, as well as over some of the Cayman Islands. We have some hurricane watches up for southern Louisiana, as well as southern Mississippi, and a little bit, I believe that also goes up into one of the counties in Alabama. And then we have tropical storm watches for also that coastal county in Alabama as well. So you can see that covers a good portion of the central Gulf Coast, where we are expecting the maximum impacts from the storm. If we look at the current track forecast, you can see that right now it is a tropical storm, but over the next couple of hours, probably either by tonight or the early morning update tomorrow. So we're talking about probably the 2 a.m. Eastern update tomorrow. That's when we could see this turn into at least a Category 1 hurricane. It should sustain Category 1 force, maybe even up near Category 2 force by Saturday. And then by Sunday morning is when we're expecting this to become a major hurricane right before landfall over southern Louisiana. And then by sometime between Sunday night and Monday morning is when we're expecting that landfall. So that's when we're going to have the worst of it if you live along the central Gulf Coast. Then expect it to weaken to a tropical storm as it moves inland, and then eventually a tropical depression as it moves into the Tennessee Valley. Once you get into this area, the main threat is going to be a mixture of some damaging winds, but also the flooding rains, which will come along with this storm. If we look at the track of this, according to some of the model guidance, you can see how most of them are within a fairly tight spread. So we're not dealing with any of the confusion like what we saw with Henry, where we had models going all over the place. We're very certain on a general location somewhere over central or eastern Louisiana, or maybe even into coastal Mississippi is where we're going to be dealing with the landfall. But again, the landfall is not where necessarily the worst of the storm is. It does mean that you're going to have some strong winds in that area. You probably will have some flooding, but it's usually areas that are east of the storm that get the brunt of the rainfall. So that's something that you want to pay attention to. Also, something you want to pay attention to is that usually right along the path of that storm is where you're going to be dealing with the strongest of the winds, especially just north and east of the storm. So also on that northeastern side of wherever this tracks is where we're probably going to be dealing with the strongest of the winds. So not necessarily if you live in eastern Texas, there isn't that much that's going to really impact you because you're to the west of the storm. Usually that's the weaker side of the storm. Of course, you still want to pay attention to this. It's just a few dozen miles further to your east, but there's not necessarily a direct impact there. But you go into, let's say, somewhere like Mississippi or Alabama, and you're dealing with a lot more impacts in terms of rainfall and wind damage from this event. So That's an issue, as well as the coastal flooding impacts as well. Taking a look at some of those flooding impacts, including the storm surge, you can see that we're dealing with 2 to 4 feet along western Louisiana. Then you go into central Louisiana, and you're dealing with about 4 to 7 feet. Into southeastern Louisiana, we're dealing with, and also into coastal Mississippi, 7 to 11 feet of storm surge. Storm surge is an amount of water that's above ground level. So you're looking at 7 feet to 11 feet above ground level. That's almost the height of some of these houses. So these are really, really high levels of storm surge inundation. And then you go into Lake Pontchartrain and the central area right around Baton Rouge and New Orleans. This is where you're dealing with maybe 3 to 5 feet, 4 to 6 feet of storm surge, which is still quite high. Then you get into eastern Mississippi, along coastal eastern Mississippi, you're dealing with 4 to 7 feet. And then into coastal Alabama, that's where we're looking at 3 to 5 feet. I would not be surprised if there's even a little bit of storm surge as you get into western Florida that's not popping up on this map. Probably 1 to 2 feet, but the majority of that storm surge is going to happen right within here. And so you want to pay attention to this because, especially if you live right along the coast here in Louisiana, you're dealing with the elevation of these areas. You're only looking at maybe 10, 20 feet above ground level in some of these areas. And most areas, especially around some of these big metro areas like New Orleans, you're dealing with your height or your elevation being below sea level. So it's not going to take a lot for this area to flood, and it's a very flood prone area, unfortunately, because there really isn't any elevation within here. It's a very flat area, and it actually dips down below sea level, so it's going to be tough to combat some of the flooding. And flooding is usually the biggest killer in most of these hurricanes or these tropical storms. It's not the winds really that, of course, does cause damage and fatalities, but it's mostly flooding because water is extremely powerful and it can really push along cars, humans, and a lot more with not too much water. So you really want to pay attention to the amount of flooding within your area. If you look at the amount of rainfall added on to the storm surge, you're dealing with 6+ inches anywhere in this orange color, which this aligns perfectly with the area with the most storm surge. And then if we look at for southeastern Louisiana, coastal Mississippi, you're looking at 10 to 15 inches of rain, even a few pockets up near 15+ inches in that pink dot just south of New Orleans. So really, really high amounts of rainfall, and that's added on to whatever storm surge you'll be dealing with along the coast as well. So not a good situation right there. If we look at the amount of flooding or the chances of flash flooding, they don't have the full forecast out just yet because we're still 3+ days out from this event, but you're looking at a 20% moderate risk, 20 to 50% chance of flash flooding. I think this will probably boost up. We're currently on a day 3 of this, so they don't have the rest of the forecast, but I would assume that we'll probably see a higher risk pop up somewhere within southeastern Louisiana over the next couple of days. Taking a look at the aircraft recon from this storm, so they sent in the NOAA aircraft into the storm, and you can see that over some of the central and northern areas just north of the low pressure center, they found wind speeds that are approaching Category 1 force, and in the upper levels of the atmosphere they found 64 knots, which is hurricane force wind speed, but again, they didn't find that on the surface just yet, so I'm assuming they're probably going to make a pass back into the storm unless they're heading out and they're going to send in another aircraft. They've been having NOAA aircraft in pretty much every hour since this storm became a tropical storm. So they've been doing a good job trying to find data on the storm. The more they can get, the better the models will be at predicting this event. If we look at the model intensity guidance, you can see I think these models are a little bit on the low end. They're only bringing this up to Category 2 strength, but we saw yesterday they were looking at low end Category 1. So if we look at this trend and we just extrapolate that, I'm assuming they're probably going to push this up to a Category 3 within the next couple of days. The National Hurricane Center already was showing again the high probability that this becomes a major hurricane, and a major hurricane by them is defined as a Category 3 or higher. So I'm assuming they're probably on board with me thinking that this will probably become a Category 3 unless something drastic happens. If you look at the GFS model the GFS ensemble models on where they think the chances of seeing hurricane force wind speeds are the highest, you can see that's going to be along south southeastern Louisiana. If we look at for the European ensemble model, you can see it's more over central Louisiana and eastern Louisiana as well still. So they have it a little bit further to the west. I would say that if you live pretty much anywhere along southern Louisiana and then into Mississippi and Alabama, you want to pay attention for the chance of strong winds. And it definitely won't hurt to at least prepare, go to the store, buy some things, or stock up. Or if you already have an evacuation order from your local officials, definitely follow that advice. Try and go to a relative's house who's maybe a little bit further inland of the coast, because that could definitely be important with how much flooding and storm surge that we're expecting within these areas, and you're adding that on to the very strong winds. If we look at some of these models and where they're placing the storm, we're going to do what we've been doing for the past couple of days with these types of storms and plot it out. So here's where the Canadian model is putting it. You can see that it's in southeastern Louisiana. If we look at the next one, which would be the GFS model, you can see how that's further to the west into central Louisiana with the landfall. If we look at the next one, which would be the European model, you can see how that one's further to the west as well of the GFS. And then if we look at the next one, which is the Icon model, you can see how that one is the furthest west of all of these, and that one's in western Louisiana with where it's bringing the storm. So that kind of gives you an idea of where all these models are bringing this. Somewhere within this Louisiana coastal area, and I would not rule out the Mississippi coast, is where we're expecting this landfall as of now. Getting into the more scientific side of this, so if you just wanted to know what's going to happen in terms of the actual impacts, this is probably the point of the video where you want to click off. If you want to know why this is happening and the information behind all the forecasts, this is where you would want to tune in a little bit more. If we look at if we look at a sounding from the middle of the storm. So you can see on the map here where the storm was. So it's in the central Gulf of Mexico according to the GFS here. Here's a sounding, and you can see how little wind shear we have. The wind barbs are pointing the exact same direction pretty much from the upper levels where it's pointing like this and all the way to the bottom levels where it's also pointing like this. Normally, if you want the storm to weaken, you would want to see maybe some of these wind barbs kind of pointing straight up where it would indicate a little bit more wind shear. You would want to see these wind barbs being a little bit more erratic and not as uniform as they are right now, where they're all pretty much in a straight line and they're really almost exactly similar to each other from the lower part of the atmosphere to the higher part of the atmosphere. So we're looking at pretty much zero wind shear within these areas. If we look at something else, here's the precipitable water over the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean. Here would be, as of right now, you can see that we're dealing with a stream of moisture coming in from the Eastern Caribbean, pushing over the storm and then eventually moving like this. And then you can see that we're also seeing that this storm is pulling in the moisture and then eventually feeding it out on the other side. With a lot of other storms, what we see is that we don't have actually a closed off low pressure. We have just kind of a stream of moisture going above its head, and then we have another stream of moisture below it, and that kind of closes off the storm. It's not going to be as strong when that happens. What we're dealing with here is that we have a stream of moisture above it, but then that's also wrapping in to another stream of moisture which is moving further to the south and then eventually curving around the storm. So you have a completely enclosed low pressure system, and you're going to see this better, and it's going to be better represented right here. So this is as it's making landfall in southern Louisiana. Again, we're still using the GFS model. It doesn't really matter which model you use for this, you're going to see the same effect, but you can see how the winds are coming in from the central or the eastern Gulf of Mexico, curving around the storm and then being fed into the center of the storm, the eye of the storm. So what we're dealing with is not this storm kind of just using some of that moisture, getting clipped with it on the northern side, and then you're dealing with another stream south of it that's kind of kind of closing it in with some of the moisture. But what we're dealing with now is that this is kind of wrapping into the storm, something that we haven't seen with too many of these storms so far this year, and that's one of the reasons that this will probably develop quite nicely, because you're dealing with this bringing in moisture from a very moisture rich area in the eastern Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean, sending that straight into the storm and funneling it in, and then you can see a little bit of that the drier air pushing into the storm, but that's not getting wrapped into the storm at all whatsoever. We have very little dry air. You have a little pocket down here, but that is not getting wrapped into the storm whatsoever. So you're really not having any effects from dry air or anything from this event. We also have a little bit of a high pressure to the north, which is sitting somewhat like this. It's a very broad high pressure, so this storm will easily be able to break through it. But that is helping to slow down the storm as it moves towards the coast, which is even worse news because that means that the rainfall will be even more prolonged. So as this is moving to the northeast, we're probably dealing with this slowing down just a little bit. So that's definitely not good news. That high pressure is also playing a decently big role into how this storm is going to play out. Looking at the sea surface temperatures, you can see these are fairly warm, even though it doesn't look like that. But if you look at the bottom of the screen, it actually shows the chart. I don't know why this website, the NOAA website, shows the colors like this, where they have purple, a deep purple, and a blue for just 27 degrees Celsius, which is around 83 degrees Fahrenheit. I would think on most maps, a deep purple would indicate somewhere in the 50s in Fahrenheit or 40s in Fahrenheit. So I think it looks a little bit misleading to me in terms of their color patterns. But either way, once you get into that green color and the yellow and the red color especially, that's where you're dealing with really warm waters. And I would say especially that yellow color is when you start to get into extremely warm waters that are very favorable for development. And you can see that the path of this storm, which it's taking, which is going to be from just west of Cuba to straight to somewhere in Louisiana or Mississippi, it's going over this little plume of warmer water, which is around 30 to 31 degrees Celsius. That's around closer to 90 to 93 degrees Fahrenheit. So very, very warm waters here that it will be able to upwell, and that could help the storm develop even more. That is going to wrap it up for today's video. We covered a lot today. So if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. I'll be answering pretty much all of your comments. So again, if you have any questions, leave a comment down below. Please consider liking the video, subscribing, and turning on notifications. We do these videos daily, and I'm fairly sure that we're going to probably have another 2 or 3 different videos, just depending on if I can get a video out before the landfall of the storm sometime on Sunday. So we'll have to see about that. But we're going to have a couple more videos on the storm, and we're going to continue to keep you updated on what we're expecting with this event. That is going to wrap it up, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Goodbye.